This is Stephen Zucker.
And Beth Harris, and we're here in the lobby. Is it a lobby?
The Great Hall.
The Great Hall.
Of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York.
And we thought we would just give a little introduction to art history and some of its major issues.
By looking at a few works of art, nothing very in-depth, but really just to give a taste of what this discipline is all about.
Okay, let's go.
Terrific.
We're looking at a sculpture, it's more than life-size, of Queen Hatshepsut, the pharaoh of Egypt, female pharaoh of Egypt. We just wanted to talk about this sculpture as an example of how artists might represent certain ideas. And in this case, I was thinking specifically of the idea of being a divine ruler.
So what you're saying is that there are certain attributes, certain qualities to the sculpture. We don't have to know anything about Egyptian culture to understand that this is a ruler.
Exactly.
And that this is a divine ruler.
Right. And so the formal things that we see here that tell us that are the fact that she's very stiff.
So very formal.
Very formal, very upright, very stiff, very frontal.
Yeah.
Perfectly symmetrical body, which also speaks to a kind of transcendence.
That's true, because she does not exist in the informal way that humans exist, but this is, in a sense, a pure symbol.
And so she doesn't relax, she doesn't seem to move, she doesn't seem to breathe, she doesn't seem to exist in the real world,
No,
but
she
rather
seems to look out infinitely.
Right, in a kind of transcendent way, in occupying a divine and spiritual realm, telling us that this is not only the ruler, but a ruler who is also divine.
Also one of the gods. There is a quality here of the eternal as well. I mean, this is carved out of stone.
Yes.
And there's so much stone, actually, interestingly, that's left embedded around her body.
Exactly.
For instance, if you look at what should be negative spaces between her waist and her arm, her upper arm, the artist
stone.
Decided to leave the stone
Yes.
in. The same between the legs,
Exactly.
between the feet, and between the throne itself and the back of her legs.
And so that idea of her embeddedness in the stone speaks to her timelessness, her permanence.
She's as permanent as the rock itself.
So now we're looking at an ancient Greek sculpture from about 600 years before Christ. That would be about 800 years after the older Egyptian sculpture that we were just looking at. And we're looking at a figure, a human figure again, but this time one that's really released from that stone that the Egyptian sculpture was in.
It's true. The Egyptian pharaoh was represented as still embedded in the stone of the world, and absolute and timeless and divine as a result. And here this figure has stood up, and that stone between the arms and the waist, between the legs, has fallen away.
It has. And so the Greeks must be moving toward a much more natural image of a human being, but still this figure does not look very natural or very real at all.
Still very stiff.
Yeah, and the hands are in the shape of fists down by the side.
Still locked to the hips.
And there's stone locking the hands to the hips.
Well, and part of that is because it's marble.
Right, yeah. And it would break off.
Yeah.
True. But the figure is still very frontal, straight, and rigid.
Very geometric, actually, in the shape of the forms.
Yes, the torso is like a triangle with these little semicircles for the breast area and upside-down triangle or diamond shape around the torso.
Even the features of the face are sort of geometric symbols of a mouth, of eyes, as opposed to representations, right?
So we seem to have an image of a human being that's more real, but still very much
very formal,
timeless image, an idea of a man, perhaps, instead of a real man.
I think that's right, and it's appropriate because this was probably a grave marker, and so it does still relate to that notion of the timelessness of the figure.
And representing something eternal and not something that's embedded in time and the moment.
The specific.
Right.
Yeah, I agree. Now we're standing in front of a later Greek sculpture, a sculpture that's called the Diadumenos by an artist whose name is Polykleitos, and this is much more naturalistic.
Oh my God, yes. This is now an image of a man, although a very beautiful, athletic man with beautiful proportions, very young and muscled. It's a man who seems to really exist in the world. He seems to be doing something.
He's tying his headband.
Yeah,
right?
He's not symmetrical.
Well, he's standing. His weight is on one leg.
His hips are kind of shifted.
And there's a real observation of the human body, direct observation and understanding of how the spine works, of how the weight is proportioned.
Right, when you move one part of the body body, another part shifts in relationship.
The artist has clearly really been actually studying the mechanics of the body.
Yes.
It's a very different experience. This is not so much a set of symbols now as somebody that we can relate to much more directly.
It is a figure that is very much like us and very much in the world the way that we are.
So if it's timeless only because of its beauty rather than timeless as a symbol of the eternal.
Exactly. And I think that just one more thing here, and that is that the ancient Greeks were really the first culture in the West to have created this very naturalistic image of a human being. And we know that the Greeks in general created the Olympics and just had
the celebration of
the human mind,
the beauty of the body and its capabilities.
Yes, and the capacity of the human mind to understand the world.
We're looking at a little walnut sculpture, a little wooden sculpture from the medieval tradition of the Madonna and Child, that is, of the Virgin Mary and the young Christ on her lap. And it's such an unusual sculpture. It's so odd, isn't it?
It is a little odd. It's about, about 1,500 years after the ancient Greek sculpture.
That's right, which was so naturalistic. And the first thing that strikes me about this is how unnaturalistic it is compared to that early Greek or that Greek sculpture.
And you could say, so what happened? Human beings learned how to make something real.
Incredibly real.
Right, in ancient Greece. So why, what happened to that?
Because this is so abstract. It's in a style that's known as Romanesque. And it's so sort of central again, very much like the Egyptian.
Right, very stiff, very
formal,
symmetrical, very formal.
And it's also a little dour, actually, isn't it?
It is. And so, what happened? I mean, and what happened is not any loss of ability so much as a
choice,
a
really.
Choice, yeah,
and so
that the artist is making
what's
to
important
represent
to them?
things here. Right. And again, we have a figure who's divine.
So this is in a sense going back to the Egyptian. It's a different religion now. Now it's the Catholic religion, but it's a religion that is again dictating that naturalism is not the most important thing.
Right. The real world is not the real day-to-day emotional world.
Physical world. So
not,
this is a representation of the divine again. This is a representation of a spiritual realm, not of the physical realm. And so in that sense, it's not so far from the Egyptian, is it?
Exactly. And so we have, like the Egyptian pharaoh, a person, but a person who is seen to also be divine.
Okay.
Right.
So it's really interesting that throughout history then, art goes back and forth between thinking that naturalism is important, representing the world is important, and to thinking about representing symbols of things that are ideas or that exist in the spiritual realm. Okay, now we've moved into the modern era.
Yeah, into a period that we recognize much more of as our own.
Right. So this is a sculpture from about 110 years ago, from about 1900, by Auguste Rodin, a French sculptor, and it's called The Walking Man.
So here we have a figure who's got all this sense of movement to it. It's hard to call this a figure, though.
It is,
because he's missing
a head
and arms.
And in fact, even the legs, although attached, are kind of dislocated. The whole thing is a bit of a mess.
It is a bit of a mess. And you get also a sense of this clay or wax.
Yes, because this would have been made not in bronze originally, but it would have been cast into bronze later.
Right.
And so what we're seeing here is something really interesting. In all of the sculptures of the human body that we looked at already, the human body was primary. It was spiritual. It was of
whole.
Enormous importance. That's right.
It was intact.
And the idea of actually purposefully dislocating and dismembering the human body, abstracting the body in this kind of aggressive, almost violent way, was completely at odds with what sculpture was meant to do.
Yeah.
But so it's interesting. So by the time we get to the year 1900, as a culture, we're capable of representing things either abstractly or we're capable of representing things with incredible precision and anatomical accuracy.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think Rodin is asking a really fundamental question. What should art be in our modern era? Mm-hmm. And I think that he's really playing with what those possibilities are. And what's interesting is actually he's been looking back to ancient Greek sculpture.
He clearly has, yes.
One of the things that is interesting, of course, is when ancient Greek sculpture was originally made, of course, it was pristine and intact, but what we have left are fragments, often broken pieces.
Right.
And Rodin is really interested in that. And one of the motivations for him not including the arms is because there's this interest in the ancient bust that has been broken.
Right, where arms have been broken off or legs or
that
parts
has
of the body.
a kind kind of interesting power and set of ideas in and of itself. And so this is really wide open.
Also a kind of modern idea of beauty, that beauty can be something that's had a sense of time.
Of history.
Right, that there's something beautiful in looking back at history. It's something that's been through time.
And sort of self-awareness of our own place in history.
Exactly.
Then. And that's a very modern idea.
Right, and I see that very much here.
Rodin is really interesting in that sense because he's really reflecting then our moment, just like the Egyptians were representing theirs, just like the Greeks were representing theirs.
And the medieval artists represented theirs.
Now we're looking at something from the early 20th century, unique forms of continuity in space by the Italian futurist Umberto Boccioni.
From 1913.
Yeah, it's a pretty outrageous sculpture.
It is, and now we have an image of a figure that, in a way, barely resembles a figure.
Except it does.
It's
really clearly somebody sort of walking through space.
Right.
And
or running, or charging.
With some real sense of energy and power and
air.
Yeah.
Swiping against it.
It's true. I mean, when I look at it, because of the sort of the power of the figure, it almost as if they're going through a very thick atmosphere, almost walking through a swimming pool.
Which is weird that a sculpture can suggest the atmosphere around it.
It's true.
It's not something that we've talked about before.
No, we haven't, but that's exactly what Boccioni is doing. I mean, the futurists were interested in the way in which space and time and motion could be represented.
Yes, and of course, I think that's a really early 20th century idea at a time when, there are factories and technology and cities and the pace of modern life.
So this is all about industrialism.
Faster. Yeah, and the machine.
But this is interesting because it's almost robotic in that sense. It's almost a sort of coming together of the human body and the machine.
Yes, it's a kind of, it's like an early cyborg almost.
It's true. One of the ways that people have looked at this, of course, is the way the figure is representing movement, not the figure itself, but the planes of space as the figure moves through it. And it's a really interesting idea to think, focus sort of on that point between the atmosphere and the figure, rather than the figure.
Yes,
right?
And so Boccioni is really representing the ideas of the early 20th century.
It's true, but there's still history here.
There is.
A lot of people look at this sculpture and will think about medieval armor, for instance. A lot of people will look at it and look and see it as a kind of futuristic figure, absolutely, but also see it as still a representation of the movement of the human body, going back to the Greeks.
Yes, and in a way very much in the same striding forward pose as the Rodin that we just talked about.
Oh, that's true. Another walking man.
Another walking man. Now we're looking at a work that's nearly contemporary to us. This is
1991, I think, right?
Yeah, and this is called The Physical Impossibility of Death in the Mind of Anyone Living. And what we're looking at we're looking at a very, very large tank filled with formaldehyde, and inside of which is a dead shark that's been injected with formaldehyde to preserve it.
And not the original.
Not the original shark, which deteriorated.
Even despite the formaldehyde.
Right. This is another shark that was even better injected with formaldehyde to preserve it for longer.
It will also dissolve eventually.
Of course. Yeah. Rather like an Egyptian mummy, in a way. An attempt to preserve it.
Oh, that's
past
so interesting.
Which is into eternity.
And it really speaks to the title.
It does. The physical impossibility of death in the mind of anyone living. And yet here we are, standing here, two of us very much alive, looking at this very dead shark, although it's posed in a way that is kind of alive.
And aggressive, and its mouth
is open.
It's suspended in liquid, suggesting that it could be swimming, perhaps even at us.
Exactly.
And we want to imbue it with a kind of life, or at least a narrative of action.
Yes, and here we sort of imagine it coming at us. Did the artist mean our death, the physical? Or are we supposed to be thinking here about our own death at the hands of this shark? Are we just thinking about?
Sort of
what's
denial
interesting
of the
to
notion
me,
of death as a symbol in and of itself, right? As a universal kind of truth. That is, can we understand the deadness of the shark as a way of understanding our own eventual mortality.
Of our own death, right. And I think that in many ways this sculpture, if we can call it a sculpture, really asks very much the same questions that the Egyptian sculpture asked, and that the Greek sculpture asked, and the medieval sculpture asked, which is, what is the meaning of life? What happens after we die?
How do we understand ourselves?
How do we understand the meaning of our own lives given our deaths?
Because art is really interesting. All of the artists who made all of the art that we've looked at are long dead.
Yes.
But the art has survived, and art it exists beyond, and it's one of those few things in our culture
That's
that
right.
actually is that
Timeless.
lasts. Yeah. And it's enormously potent, this notion. And when artists make a work, there is this idea that it can outlast them. So I want to go back to an idea that you raised just a second ago, which is you asked, is this a sculpture? Because everything else that we've seen was something that depicted something that existed naturally in the world.
Right. So an artist took some material
and made
and
it look.
transformed it into a human being.
That's right. But here we have not a representation of a shark, an actual dead shark.
Right.
But it's an actual dead shark that's representing a set of ideas.
Yes.
It's
not art in the way that we normally think of art as something that
craftsmanship.
human beings make.
Right. This is not
with
about
their hands.
This is not about craftsmanship. Damien Hirst did not say, "Oh, if I only move that dorsal fin a little bit this way."
Right.
Damien Hirst isn't concerned about the color of the skin of the shark. Damien Hirst is taking an actual shark, which is a given, and so can that be seen as art?
Why a shark here? If all of those objects represent their historical period, what is Damien Hirst telling us about what it means to be alive at the end of the 20th century and beginning of the 21st century?
I think it's a fairly dark notion.
You think so? Maybe.